They were once the voices that defined the heart of America, singers who filled dance halls, topped the charts, and shaped the very soul of country music. But behind the spotlight, many of these legends faced a different reality: broken finances, fading fame, and lonely endings. In this video, we revisit 10 forgotten country legends who spent their final days in poverty. Their rise was glorious. Lefty Frizzell, 1928 to 1935. Few voices in country music history carried the same weight as Lefty Frizzell. Born in Corsicana, Texas, he became one of the most influential singers of the 1950s, crafting a smooth, emotional style that would later inspire legends like George Jones, Willie Nelson, and Merle Haggard. His early career exploded with hits such as If You've Got the Money, I've Got the Time, and he quickly became a household name. Lefty wasn't just a performer. He was a trendsetter, with countless young singers imitating his phrasing and vocal delivery. At his peak, he was among the brightest stars of the Grand Ole Opry, a man who seemed destined to remain a cornerstone of the genre forever. But fame came at a heavy price. Lefty struggled with the demands of the spotlight, and alcohol soon became his constant companion. As the years went by, his drinking affected not only his health, but also his reliability as a performer. Missed shows, erratic behavior, and declining record sales began to erode the career he had built. By the mid-1960s, Nashville was already shifting toward a new sound, and Lefty, once the pioneer, now seemed out of place. His financial troubles mounted, and despite writing and recording dozens of songs, royalties often slipped through his fingers due to poor management and bad deals. In his later years, Frizzell's life was marked by decline. Once commanding packed auditoriums, he found himself playing smaller venues, often for meager pay. Friends recalled his generosity, sometimes too generous, giving away money he couldn't afford to lose. He lived a modest life, far removed from the glitz of his earlier fame, and his health deteriorated rapidly from years of heavy drinking. By the time he was only in his mid-40s, Lefty looked far older than his years, worn down by a combination of hard living and bitter disappointment. On July 19, 1975, Lefty Frizzell died from a massive stroke at just 47 years old. At the time of his death, he was far from wealthy, his career long eclipsed by those he had influenced. To many, it was a cruel irony. The man who had given country music so much had ended his life in obscurity and poverty. His funeral drew fellow musicians who acknowledged that without Lefty, their own careers might not have been possible. Yet for the public, his passing barely made headlines. Today, Lefty Frizzell is remembered more as an influence than a superstar, a pioneer whose innovations shaped the sound of country, but whose personal demons denied him a secure legacy. His story is a sobering reminder that even the brightest stars can burn out too soon, leaving behind brilliance overshadowed by tragedy. For a brief moment in the late 1970s, Johnny Paycheck was the voice of the working man. With his defiant anthem, "Take This Job and Shove It," he captured the frustrations of blue-collar America and became a symbol of rebellion in country music. Born Donald Eugene Lytle in Ohio, Paycheck started as a sideman, playing bass and singing backup for legends like George Jones. But when he stepped into the spotlight on his own, his gritty voice and outlaw image resonated deeply with fans who saw him as a man unafraid to say what they felt. At his peak, he sold millions of records, filled arenas, and lived the life of a true country outlaw. But with fame came chaos. Paycheck's outlaw persona was no act. He lived it every day. His life spiraled into a blur of alcohol, cocaine, and reckless spending. He bought luxury cars, lavish homes, and surrounded himself with excess, rarely thinking of tomorrow. The money flowed in fast, but it flowed out even faster. By the mid-1980s, his fortune was gone, and his troubles were only beginning. Lawsuits, divorces, and unpaid taxes left him drowning in debt. He filed for bankruptcy more than once, each time slipping further from the heights he had once known. Then came the scandal that sealed his downfall. In 1985, Paycheck was arrested for shooting a man in the head during a barroom brawl in Ohio. He claimed self-defense, but the court saw it differently. Convicted of aggravated assault, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. Though he only served about 2, the damage to his reputation and career was devastating. When he emerged, country music had moved on, and the man once seen as a rebel hero was now more a cautionary tale than a star. In his final years, Paycheck's health collapsed. Years of drug and alcohol abuse left him frail and often hospitalized. He leaned heavily on friends, charities, and even the Grand Ole Opry Trust Fund to cover medical expenses. The man who had once commanded millions was now living from one hospital stay to the next, struggling to pay for the basics of life. Johnny Paycheck died in 2003 at the age of 64. At his death, he was virtually penniless, leaving behind not a fortune, but a legacy of songs that spoke to defiance, heartbreak, and rebellion. For many fans, the irony was unavoidable. The man who had sung about rejecting a job and living life his own way had ultimately been undone by the very lifestyle he celebrated. Today, his story is remembered as both a triumph of raw talent and a tragedy of self-destruction. In the 1940s, Spade Cooley was a household name on the West Coast, hailed as the king of Western swing. Born Donald Clyde Cooley in Oklahoma, he rose from humble beginnings to dominate a genre that blended country, jazz, and big band influences. His charismatic presence and musical talent made him a star, not only on the stage, but also on the screen. Cooley appeared in several Hollywood films, and his orchestra was considered one of the best in the business. For a time, he rivaled even Bob Wills in shaping the Western swing sound. Fame, money, and adoration seemed endless, and Cooley reveled in the spotlight. Yet beneath the glittering surface was a man consumed by darkness. Cooley's personal life was volatile and violent. Known for his temper and controlling nature, he was infamous for treating those around him harshly, particularly his wife, Ella May. As the years passed, his drinking and paranoia deepened, and the glamorous facade began to crack. His music career waned in the 1950s as tastes shifted, and his erratic behavior alienated both fans and colleagues. The tragedy reached its climax in 1961. In a shocking act of brutality, Cooley brutally murdered his wife in front of their young daughter. The crime stunned the nation, not only because of its savagery, but because it involved a man once celebrated as a star. Convicted of second-degree murder, Cooley was sentenced to life in prison. In an instant, the king of Western swing was dethroned, his legacy forever tainted by violence and scandal. In prison, Cooley faded into obscurity. The glamorous life of Hollywood premieres and packed dance halls was replaced by concrete walls and a prison uniform. His fortune evaporated, his reputation was destroyed, and he became a forgotten figure in the music world. For many, his name was no longer associated with groundbreaking music, but with infamy. On November 23, 1969, Spade Cooley collapsed from a heart attack while performing at a sheriff's benefit concert during a short prison furlough. He was 58 years old. By then, he had nothing, no fortune, no career, and no redemption. His death passed quietly, a grim reminder of how far and how fast a star could fall. Today, Spade Cooley's story is rarely told, not because he lacked talent, but because his crimes overshadowed his achievements. Once hailed as a pioneer, he is remembered more as a cautionary tale of how fame, violence, and self-destruction can erase even the brightest legacy. His end, in poverty and disgrace, stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of country music. For more than half a century, Hank Snow was a towering figure in country music. Born in a small fishing village in Nova Scotia, Canada, he endured a childhood of hardship and abuse before finding salvation in music. With his distinctive voice and masterful guitar playing, Snow carved out a career that eventually brought him to the Grand Ole Opry, where he remained a beloved fixture for nearly 50 years. He recorded over 80 hit songs, including I'm Moving On and Hello Love, and influenced countless artists from Elvis Presley to Willie Nelson. At his height, Hank Snow was not only a star, but a global ambassador for country music, touring the world and introducing new audiences to the Nashville sound. But even legends are not immune to life's harsher realities. Behind the glitter of the Opry stage, Snow faced ongoing battles with money and trust. Though he earned millions during his long career, he often found himself short of funds due to poor business decisions, failed investments, and managers who took advantage of him. His generosity, too, drained his resources. He often gave to friends, charities, and struggling musicians without thinking of his own security. By the later decades of his life, his fortune had largely slipped away, leaving him far less secure than his fame suggested. In his personal life, Snow endured heartbreak and loneliness. His son, Jimmy Rogers Snow, also a musician, struggled with his own career and distance from his father. Snow's marriage lasted for decades, but much of his final years were marked by illness and the fading of old friendships. For a man who had once commanded international stages, the quietness of his twilight years was striking. By the 1990s, Snow's health declined rapidly. Arthritis and respiratory issues kept him from performing, and he lived in near seclusion in Madison, Tennessee. Although he had been inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1979, the financial security one might expect from such an honor was absent. Friends and colleagues later noted that Snow spent his final years in relative poverty, living modestly, far from the wealth his long career should have guaranteed. Hank Snow passed away on December 20th, 1999, at the age of 85. His death was noted in the music world, but the grandeur of his early career contrasted sharply with the obscurity and struggle of his last years. He had given country music some of its most enduring songs, yet died without the financial comfort that should have accompanied such a legacy. Today, Hank Snow is remembered as a pioneer who opened doors for generations of country artists. But his story also reflects the precarious nature of fame, how even decades of success can vanish into poverty when the music fades and the industry moves on. Few artists embodied the outlaw spirit of country music as fully as David Allan Coe. Born in Akron, Ohio, Coe lived a turbulent early life that included time in reform schools and prison before he ever picked up a guitar professionally. When he emerged onto the Nashville scene in the 1970s, he brought with him a raw, unapologetic persona that set him apart from the polished mainstream stars. Songs like You Never Even Called Me by My Name and The Ride became cult classics, and his songwriting skills earned him recognition when artists like Tanya Tucker and Johnny Paycheck turned his compositions into hits. For a time, Coe looked like a permanent fixture in the outlaw movement alongside Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson. But success came with controversy. Coe thrived on being provocative, often releasing underground albums filled with explicit lyrics that alienated much of the industry. While some fans admired his refusal to play by the rules, others saw him as self-destructive. Despite his talent, he struggled to maintain steady mainstream success, and his career became increasingly reliant on touring rather than record sales. Money came in waves, large paydays from tours, followed by equally large losses due to poor financial planning, lawsuits, and a lavish lifestyle. The IRS became one of his greatest adversaries. Over the years, Coe fell behind on taxes, leading to mounting debts and financial strain. At the same time, his health began to fail. Decades of hard living, motorcycle crashes, and a lifetime of substance abuse caught up with him. Friends recalled that Coe often seemed to live on the edge, as if he believed the outlaw image he projected was inseparable from who he really was. By the 2000s, Coe was touring smaller venues, often relying on his name recognition among die-hard fans to stay afloat. He was far removed from the days of sharing the spotlight with the biggest names in country music. His wife and family stood by him, but financially, Coe was no longer secure. Reports described him as living in relative poverty, with few of the riches that decades of songwriting and performing should have earned him. David Allan Coe died in 2023 at the age of 84. His passing received modest attention, but nowhere near the recognition given to the legends he had once stood beside. For many, his story symbolized the double-edged sword of the outlaw life, the freedom to defy the system, but at the cost of stability, reputation, and long-term security. Today, Coe is remembered as one of the most controversial figures in country music, a man of immense talent whose choices led him down a path of isolation and poverty. His songs endure, but his life serves as a stark reminder that rebellion comes with a price, and that even legends can die forgotten and broke. Blaze Foley was never a household name, but among musicians and songwriters, he was revered as a poet of the brokenhearted. Born Michael David Fuller in Arkansas, Foley grew up in Texas, where his love for music blossomed. His style was raw and soulful, capturing the pain and beauty of everyday life. Songs like If I Could Only Fly later became country standards, covered by artists such as Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson. Despite his immense talent, Blaze lived on the margins of fame, drifting between gigs, often broke, but always leaving a deep impression on those who heard him perform. Foley's life was defined by struggle. He battled alcoholism, often sabotaging his own career opportunities with reckless behavior. Friends remembered his kindness and generosity, but also his volatility. He was fiercely protective of his art, famously duct taping his shoes to save money and spending his nights on couches, in cars, or wherever he could find shelter. Though respected in Austin's thriving music scene of the 1970s and 80s, he never enjoyed commercial success. He was, in many ways, the quintessential songwriter's songwriter, admired but never rewarded. Financial hardship was a constant shadow. Blaze frequently lived in poverty, relying on friends and small shows to get by. He poured everything he had into his music, but the music industry rarely gave anything back. While other country stars of the era found wealth and security, Foley remained on the outside looking in, a drifter with a guitar and a stubborn refusal to compromise. The tragedy of Blaze Foley's life came to a shocking end in 1989. At the age of 39, he was shot and killed during a domestic dispute while defending a friend. His death, sudden and senseless, left him with little recognition outside a small circle of fans and fellow musicians. He died with no fortune, no estate, and no safety net. Just a handful of recordings and the memory of his haunting performances. In the years after his death, Foley's legend grew. Townes Van Zandt, his close friend, wrote tributes to him, and younger artists began to rediscover his work. Yet during his lifetime, Blaze Foley knew nothing but obscurity and poverty. He lived and died as a man out of step with commercial success, but fully committed to the honesty of his craft. Today, Blaze Foley is celebrated as a tragic icon of Texas songwriting, proof that influence does not always come with fame or fortune. His final days in poverty were the natural continuation of a life lived on the edge, and his story remains one of country music's most heartbreaking reminders of how easily great talent can be overlooked. For much of the 1950s and 1960s, Faron Young was a shining star in Nashville. Nicknamed the Hillbilly Heartthrob, he rose to fame with hits like Hello Walls and Live Fast, Love Hard, Die Young. With his smooth voice and charismatic stage presence, Young became one of the most popular country singers of his generation. He was a regular at the Grand Ole Opry and enjoyed crossover success on both radio and television. To fans, he seemed untouchable, a man with talent, charm, and a career destined for longevity. But behind the curtain, cracks began to show. Young was known for his quick temper and reckless lifestyle. His success was undermined by battles with alcohol and personal demons. Although he made millions over the course of his career, he struggled to hold on to his money. Poor financial decisions, coupled with a volatile personality, alienated business partners and strained personal relationships. As Nashville changed and younger stars took the spotlight, Young's place in the industry began to slip. By the 1980s, the once golden boy of country music found himself sidelined. His records no longer sold as they once did, and he became increasingly bitter about being forgotten by the industry he had helped build. Financial difficulties mounted, and the lavish lifestyle he once enjoyed was no longer sustainable. Friends noted that he often complained about money, feeling betrayed by an industry that seemed eager to move on without him. In his later years, Young's health declined. He struggled with emphysema and depression, conditions that left him both physically weak and emotionally fragile. The man who once commanded crowds with charm and vitality now lived in obscurity, his fortune dwindling and his fame fading. The combination of declining health, loneliness, and financial insecurity became unbearable. On December 10, 1996, Faron Young took his own life at the age of 64. The news shocked many, though those close to him knew of his struggles. He left behind not wealth or stability, but a catalog of music that continues to influence artists today. His death highlighted the stark contrast between the bright lights of fame and the crushing reality of being forgotten. Today, Faron Young is remembered as one of country music's great voices, but also as a cautionary tale. His story illustrates how even those who once seemed invincible can end up isolated and impoverished. The tragedy of his final days underscores a haunting truth. In Nashville, glory can vanish in an instant, leaving behind little more than echoes of applause and songs that outlive the singer. Stonewall Jackson was a name that once rang proudly through the halls of the Grand Ole Opry. Born in Tabor City, North Carolina, and raised in poverty, he seemed destined for hardship until music gave him an escape. By the late 1950s, he had secured a spot on the Opry, remarkably, before even signing a record deal, a rare feat that spoke to his undeniable talent. His hits, including Waterloo, BJ the DJ, and Life to Go, made him a staple of the classic country era. For more than 4 decades, he was a fixture on the Opry stage, adored for his down-to-earth style and storytelling songs. Yet as country music evolved, Stonewall Jackson's star began to fade. The rise of the slicker, Nashville sound in the 1970s pushed aside many traditional artists. While he still performed, his commercial success dwindled. Tours became smaller, and record sales slowed dramatically. Despite years of loyalty to the Opry, he often felt sidelined by the institution he had helped sustain. In 2006, he made headlines by suing the Grand Ole Opry, claiming age discrimination and arguing that he had been denied performance opportunities in favor of younger acts. Though he won a settlement, the case underscored just how financially strained his later years had become. Money was a persistent struggle. Like many country stars of his generation, Stonewall Jackson never amassed the kind of long-term wealth that might have secured a comfortable retirement. Royalties were modest, and the Opry shows, while providing steady income for decades, did not translate into lasting financial security. Friends and family often described him as proud and reluctant to ask for help, even when his circumstances grew dire. His health began to decline in his final years, leaving him unable to perform regularly. By the late 2010s, he was living quietly, largely forgotten by the mainstream country audience that once embraced him. The man who had helped define an era of country storytelling was reduced to the fringes, remembered only by diehard fans and Opry historians. Stonewall Jackson passed away in December 2021 at the age of 89, after a long battle with vascular dementia. His death was noted with respect but without the fanfare that might have accompanied other country legends. By then, he had spent years in financial difficulty, a once proud star fading into obscurity. Today, his story resonates as both inspiring and tragic. He rose from poverty to become a star, but his life came full circle, ending in the same kind of financial hardship he had once escaped. Stonewall Jackson remains a symbol of traditional country music's golden era and of how easily the industry forgets even its most loyal contributors. Keith Whitley's voice carried a purity and emotional depth that made him one of the brightest rising stars of country music in the 1980s. Born in Sandy Hook, Kentucky, Whitley began performing as a teenager, blending bluegrass traditions with a modern edge. His breakthrough came with songs like Don't Close Your Eyes, When You Say Nothing at All, and I'm No Stranger to the Rain, tracks that cemented him as a new face of Nashville and hinted at a future as one of the genre's defining voices. For fans and critics alike, Whitley was the perfect bridge between tradition and the future of country. Yet behind the acclaim, Keith battled demons that would ultimately end his life. From his teenage years, he had struggled with alcoholism, a problem that only deepened as fame brought new pressures. Despite his incredible voice and magnetic presence, he lived in constant turmoil, swinging between professional triumphs and personal crises. Friends and fellow musicians admired his talent, but worried about his inability to stay sober. Financial stability should have been within his grasp. His records were selling well, and he was beginning to headline tours. But his lifestyle consumed much of what he earned. Alcohol drained his health, his focus, and his ability to build a long-lasting career. While he wasn't destitute in the traditional sense, he lived precariously, without the security or savings one might expect of a star on the rise. His young family, including his wife, fellow country singer Lori Morgan, felt both the benefits of his fame and the crushing weight of his instability. On May 9, 1989, tragedy struck. Keith Whitley died from acute alcohol poisoning at the age of just 34. His death shocked Nashville, coming at a time when his career was only beginning to flourish. In financial terms, he left little behind, no vast fortune, no long-established estate. Instead, he left his wife and children with the burden of grief and the haunting thought of what might have been. For an artist with so much promise, his end felt devastatingly premature, both in life and in the legacy he might have built. In the years after his passing, Whitley's influence grew. Many artists, from Alan Jackson to Garth Brooks, have cited him as an inspiration, and his songs remain staples of the genre. Yet his story is as much a warning as it is a tribute. Talent alone cannot overcome self-destruction. Keith Whitley's final days were marked not by glory or comfort, but by the quiet tragedy of a man undone by his own battles, leaving behind a legacy cut painfully short. Del Reeves may not be the first name that comes to mind when people think of country music legends, but in the 1960s, he was a star who brought humor, energy, and a unique flair to the Nashville scene. Born Franklin Delano Reeves in Sparta, North Carolina, he earned fame with his playful novelty hit Girl on the Billboard in 1965, which climbed to #1 on the charts. His lively stage presence and infectious personality made him a popular act, and for a time, he seemed destined to enjoy a long, comfortable career. He became a member of the Grand Ole Opry, hosted television shows, and toured extensively, building a loyal following. Yet Del Reeves's career gradually lost momentum. While he continued to record, the novelty style that had made him famous did not carry the same weight in later decades. Country music's sound was changing, and Reeves found himself struggling to adapt. By the 1970s, the hits were fewer, and the money was tighter. Like many country performers of his generation, he relied heavily on touring to sustain his income. The financial strain grew as the years wore on, and the spotlight that once seemed so secure began to dim. Reeves also faced personal and health challenges. Though not as notorious for wild living as some of his peers, he nonetheless dealt with the pressures of fading fame and mounting bills. Friends later recalled that he was generous to a fault, often helping others while neglecting his own long-term security. Despite being a recognized Opry star, his financial situation became increasingly precarious, leaving him with little savings or assets by the time he reached his later years. By the 1990s, Reeves was no longer a visible force in country music. He retired from performing due to health problems, including emphysema, which left him frail and unable to tour. Without the ability to perform, his primary source of income disappeared. He lived quietly, far removed from the spotlight that had once defined him. And like too many of his peers, his final years were marked by financial hardship. Del Reeves passed away on January 1st, 2007, at the age of 73. His death drew modest tributes within the country community, but went largely unnoticed by the wider public. For a man who had once been a star on the Opry stage, it was a quiet and somber end. Today, Del Reeves is remembered fondly by dedicated country fans as a performer who brought laughter and joy to his audiences. Yet his final days in poverty stand as a poignant reminder of the fleeting nature of fame in Nashville. His story, like so many others, underscores the fragility of success and the cruel reality that even Opry legends can die broke and forgotten.